Paddington was in a mess, and for once it wasn't entirely his fault. The person mostly to blame was a lady called Granny Green. Granny Green wrote cookery articles for one of Mrs. Brown's magazines, and it was her recipe for oldie-fashioned butter toffee that was really the cause of Paddington's downfall. If it hadn't appeared on the very day Mrs. Brown and Mrs. Bird were out shopping, Paddington might not have been quite so tempted to have a go himself. He tried adding some more ingredients for good measure, but for once, luck didn't seem to be on his side. When he went to stir it, he found the toffee had already set hard. Paddington gazed gloomily at the saucepan. All Granny Green's saucepans were as bright as a new pin. There was certainly no mention of any of them having spoons stuck inside them. Nor, for that matter, were her kitchen windows all steamed up. Paddington decided it was high time he cleaned them before they set hard, too. Toffee steam was very sticky. It was then that he had his second shock of the day. As he rubbed the glass clean, he caught sight of Mrs. Brown and Mrs. Bird outside. They appeared to be trying to say something, but he didn't stop to see what it was. Instead, he sat down and waited for the storm to break. "What on earth's been going on?" cried Mrs. Bird. "I've been trying my paw at toffee making," said Paddington sadly. "I thought it would be a surprise." "Toffee? It looks more like glue to me." "I've never seen such a mess," agreed Mrs. Bird. "I suggest a certain young bear had better get down on his paws and knees and scrub my kitchen floor." Mrs. Bird paused. While she'd been talking, a strange look had come over Paddington's face. "Is anything the matter?" she asked. "I'm not sure, Mrs. Bird," gasped Paddington. I've got a bit of a pain in my stomach, and I can't put my legs out straight. Ooh. You haven't been eating this stuff, have you?" "Well, I did test it once or twice, Mrs. Brown," groaned Paddington. "Wish I hadn't now." "Gracious me, no wonder you've got a pain. It's probably set in a hard lump inside. I'll call an ambulance." "An ambulance?" "Bears," said Mrs. Bird grimly, "have emergencies the same as anyone else. I shall dial 999. "Oh," groaned Paddington. "Couldn't you dial 111 instead, Mrs. Bird? It would be a lot quicker." Sir Mortimer Carraway opened the door of the hospital emergency ward and peered round the waiting room. "Are you or that young bear's next of kin?" he asked. The Browns exchanged anxious glances. Somehow they had expected a much longer wait. "Well, he lives with us," said Mrs. Brown, "but he comes from darkest Peru." "Is he going to be all right?" asked Judy. "I think he'll pull through. Bad case of galloping toffee drips. Most unusual. On the stomach, too. Worst possible place." "Galloping toffee drips," repeated Mr. Brown. "I think I must have spilt some on my fur by mistake," explained Paddington. "I had my duffel coat open when I was stirring it. I expect it set hard when I sat down for a rest." "I'm afraid this will leave him with a bare patch for a week or two, but a strict diet of marmalade will soon make it grow again." "Perhaps I could glue it back on with some more toffee," said Paddington hopefully. "If you don't mind," said Sir Mortimer, "I shall keep it. I've never had a bear's emergency before, and I'd like to have this fur framed." "In that case," said Paddington, "perhaps I'd better start on my diet straight away, Sir Mortimer. Otherwise I might catch cold before it grows again, and then you've another emergency on your hands." One day, Mr. Curry entered a golf competition, and he asked Paddington to act as his caddy. Paddington wasn't very keen on doing favours for Mr. Curry. They always seemed to turn out wrong. All the same, he felt most important as he made his way onto the golf course. Especially when Arnold Parker, the world-famous champion who was acting as judge, waved to him. "Good afternoon, Mr. Parker," he called.
There you are, Bear," exclaimed Mr. Curry. "Thought you were never coming. Anyway, now you are here. Keep your eyes open, and remember, I shall hold you responsible if my ball gets lost."
It's all right, Mr. Curry, said Paddington. I've marked it with a special marmalade chunk.
Marmalade chunk? Snorted Mr. Curry. Are you sure it won't come off?
Quite sure, Mr. Curry, said Paddington. Mrs. Bird always says my chunks stick to anything.
Well, I hope you're right, Bear. This is a very important event. It's to see who can hit the ball the furthest. I don't want my ball getting mixed up with anyone else's. Now, when I go up to collect my prize, I'd like you to... Bear! That's my best club you've broken.
Perhaps you could tie the two ends together, Mr. Curry, said Paddington hopefully.
Tie the ends together? Bellowed Mr. Curry. Why,
Is anything the matter? Asked Arnold Parker. Can I be of assistance? Hello, Mr. Parker, exclaimed Paddington. I'm afraid I've been having trouble with Mr. Curry's clubs. You're welcome to borrow mine, said Arnold Parker.
Parker?
Said Mr. Curry.
Not the Arnold Parker? I was only joking, of course, Bear. Remind me to give you 5p when we get home. Now, have you got my tea?
Your tea, Mr. Curry, exclaimed Paddington. You can have one of my marmalade sandwiches if you like. It was fresh this morning. I made it specially.
I mean the sort of tea you put your ball on. I want to address it.
Paddington began to look more and more confused. He'd never heard of anyone hitting a ball off a marmalade sandwich before, let alone writing his address on it. I think, whispered Arnold Parker, your friend means he's ready to go. Paddington was about to take cover when there was a loud cry from Mr. Curry.
Oh! Bear, I've just slipped on your marmalade sandwich. I've hurt my leg. Now I shan't be able to play.
Perhaps I could do it instead, Mr. Curry. Your old club is just the right length now. Mr. Curry sat up holding his leg. He looked as if he had a lot more to say, but fortunately his voice was drowned by a passing train.
Four,
shouted Arnold Parker above the noise.
5,
cried Pat excitedly. Mr. Curry stared at the Browns.
I've won a new set of golf clubs, he exclaimed.
No, said Mrs. Brown. Paddington did, but he's giving them to you to make up for your breaking yours.
His ball went 9 miles.
Arnold Parker says it must be a world record, broke in Jonathan. I bet the engine driver was surprised.
The engine driver? What is everyone on about?
Your ball landed in a goods train by mistake, Mr. Curry, explained Paddington. The driver sent it back from the next station, and Mr. Parker said there was nothing in the rules to stop it being counted. So I won first prize.
Unlike some people,
broke in Mrs. Bird,
bears always fall on their feet.
That's what Mr. Parker said, exclaimed Paddington. He's going to put marmalade chunks on all his golf balls in future. He thinks it might bring him luck. Besides, if he ever gets lost in a bunker, at least he'll never go hungry. One day, Mr. Curry stepped on one of Paddington's marmalade sandwiches by mistake and ended up in hospital. From that moment on, the Browns were bombarded with postcards asking for supplies. Cakes, grapes, magazines, the list was never ending. So Paddington offered to take it all in his shopping basket on wheels. I do hope we're doing the right thing, said Mrs. Brown, as Paddington set off for the hospital. I shouldn't worry, replied Mrs. Bird. Knowing that bear, he'll look after himself. It's not Paddington I'm worried about, said Mrs. Brown. It's the hospital. Can I help you? Asked the receptionist. Well, said Paddington, I've really come to see Mr. Curry, but I wonder if I ought to have my head examined first. Your head? Oh, dear. Is it urgent? Very, said Paddington firmly. "I think I've packed too many marmalade sandwiches under my hat."
"It sounds to me as though you need to see a psychiatrist," said the lady.
"A psychiatrist?" repeated Paddington. "I've never heard of one of those before. It's a very long word for people who look after things up here. I'll get our Mr. Heinz to deal with you. He takes on all our difficult cases, and he's never had a failure yet." "Thank you very much," said Paddington, "but I hope he likes marmalade. He might get rather sticky."